Welcome everyone to Making the Modern Individual. Thank you so much for joining us either in person or via Zoom, or to those of you who are going to listen later to our recording. And thank you to all those who worked to make today possible, to our speaker, Dr. Johan Hansen, to our colleagues at USC Libraries and the Collections Convergence Initiative, Tyson Gaskell, Patty Johnson, and Albert Badalino, to the USC Max Kade Institute, Paul Lerner, Helga Schwartz, and Gabriel Reinstrom, and to the Huntington USC Institute on California in the West, my colleagues, Bill Deverell, Stephanie Yee, and Jessica Kim. My name is Elizabeth Logan, and I'm the Associate Director of ICW. On behalf of all of these institutions, I would like to invite you to check out our websites to look for future programming. I'll just highlight quickly two that are coming up for ICW in May. On May 9th at noon, we have a virtual presentation with moderated by the Dean of the School of Education called Teaching Race in the West, that looks at some of the legislation impacting K-12 teaching and the topics of race. And on May 18th, also at noon virtually, we're offering a program called Mexican LA, where we're really excited that USC's Natalia Molina and UCLA's Kelly Leiter Hernandez are going to be speaking together about their two new works on Mexican Los Angeles with Gustavo Arellano. So you are welcome to join those, as well as all of the other events offered by the Max Kade and ICW. Back to today, our order of programming will be to hear from the speaker and then have time for Q&A. And we'll be gathering those questions, both from those of us in this room and from those who are visiting us virtually. So please do type your questions in the Q&A and we will see them and raise them. It is now my honor to introduce Professor of History and the Director of the USC Max Kade Institute, Paul Lerner, who will introduce this afternoon's speaker.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and it's good to see those of you who are here in person with us, and welcome everybody who is following virtually. It's really been a pleasure working with Elizabeth and the people at ICW, so I hope we can collaborate many more times in the future. It's been a while since we've done something together. This is actually our last Max Kade event of the academic year, but we've got a few things already planned for the fall, and you can find out about those on our website, or if you sign up to the newsletter to get our regular emails. So it's really now my pleasure to introduce Jan Hansen, who's here with us as a visiting fellow, who I've been really pleased to be getting to know over the last months. He's a historian of the US and Europe in the modern period, 19th and 20th centuries. And as you'll see, his interests range quite broadly through social, political, environmental, urban, and technological history. He's going to talk about his current research today. In the past, he's worked mainly on the history of the Cold War, specifically on anti-nuclear protests in West Germany in the 1980s. And he's written Abschied vom Kalten Krieg, saying goodbye or departure from the Cold War, the Social Democrats, and the I couldn't come up with a good translation for Nachrüstungsstreit, like the debate over sort of like rebuilding, or what's a good English translation for
rearmament?
Rearmament, thank you. That word wasn't coming to me. The rearmament debate in the Social Democrats, 1977 to 1987, which was published in 2016 by De Gruyter. So he's been, Dr. Hansen's been at the Humboldt University in Berlin since 2014 as assistant professor of history. He was a visiting professor in Brussels, also at the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C. And he was a Dibner Research Fellow in History of Science at the Huntington, just down the road here. He's also a book review editor for Haso zum Kult, which is really, if you don't know, really the kind of primary German language and sometimes English language vehicle for online discussions in the humanities and social sciences. So he arrived this past August as a Theodor Linden Fellow funded by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and is here for an 18-month stay, which is really wonderful for us. And he is working on this project that he'll be talking about today, which, as you'll see, focuses on infrastructure, water, electrification, and how this sort of process has affected daily life and kind of the modern individual in the period between 1850 and 1950. His talk this afternoon, as you can see here, is entitled Urban Infrastructure and Daily Life in Los Angeles and Berlin, 1850 to 1940. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jan Hansen.
Thank you so very much for the kind introduction, Paul, and for organizing this event. And thank you also to Helga Schwarz, Elizabeth, and Patty, to the Institute for California and the West and the USC Libraries Collections Convergence Initiative for co-hosting this event. I'm really excited to be here this afternoon to present my research, and I'm really overjoyed to be here at USC and the Kade Institute this year. It's been such a great experience so far. And thank you all for coming. And let's dive right in. I want to take you right back to 1939. In Los Angeles, that was the eve of World War II. While the threat of fascism seemed a long way off, coping with the Great Depression still preoccupied people in Los Angeles. Some of the worst effects had been mitigated by the Works Progress Administration's enormous job creation program, which had been launched in 1935 as part of the New Deal. The WPA put thousands of people to work across the country. One of the measures taken in Los Angeles with WPA funds was a household census in 1939. Interviewers visited all low-income households in Los Angeles to collect information about people's living conditions. Approximately 500,000 dwelling cards from these surveys have survived and are housed here at USC Library, providing a fascinating source on the everyday history of Los Angeles. And I'm going to talk about 4 dwelling cards from Rosecrans Avenue as examples. As you may know, Rosecrans Avenue is a major east-west tangent south of downtown and thus itself a crucial infrastructure in Los Angeles. It has a length of approximately 27 miles, so it is unusually long. It begins in Manhattan Beach and ends in Fullerton. This road, which today passes through several neighborhoods with high unemployment and high crime rates, is so fascinating because in the late 1930s, it was located on the urban frontier. And this urban frontier character is evident in the dwelling cards. At house number 3250, as this dwelling card reveals, lived a family of five of Euro-American origin. The family lived in a single family home that had been built in 1933. And as the interviewer noted, needed only minor repairs. The family paid a monthly mortgage of $15. This dwelling card also tells us that there was a toilet and a bathroom, hot and cold water, electric light, a gas stove, and a fridge also powered by gas, but no heating. If you compare this dwelling card with other cards, you can see that these were really average living conditions in the area. At number 341, a family of 7 lived, whose origin the interviewer indicated as Oriental. Their house had been built in 1927, indicating that the Rosecrans Avenue area was just being developed. Again, there was a toilet, bathroom, hot and cold water, but no fridge. At house number 3328, a Mexican family of 9 lived in only 3 rooms for a monthly mortgage of $10. The house had been built in 1924. The interviewer classified it as unfit for use, presumably because it had neither a toilet nor a bathroom, and there was only cold water and no light. What is particularly telling about this card is that the interviewer noted on the back that the family used an oil lamp for lighting and cooked and heated with a wood stove. A final example. At house number 3274, a family of 7 lived in only 2 rooms for a monthly mortgage of $10. The interviewer also judged this house as unfit for use, although it had been built in 1937 and the residents, who were Euro-Americans, had been living in it for 10 months. There was neither a toilet nor a bathroom, only cold water, no heating, but there were electric lights, a gas stove, and a fridge. Again, we find a short note on the back. Bathroom and toilet were unusable. Residents would use a potable gas heater and heat the house with the stove in the kitchen. What do these dwelling cards tell us? First, the dwelling cards show the process of suburbanization in the 1930s. All houses had been built recently. Residents owned their homes, modest as they were. Rosecrans Avenue is just one example of a society of kind of recent homeowners. Second, the dwelling cards show how diverse the living conditions were, even within the same street. A crucial vector by which municipal authorities or the WPA determined the living standards in a household was the availability of water and electricity. Third, the cards show that access to water and electricity did not follow a simple explanation. Whether a household was connected to the water and sewer system and whether it had electric light and a fridge depended on the intersection of class and race. Because the Los Angeles City Charter required property owners to pay for their house connections, with which many of non-white and poor residents could not afford. So this is part of a very well-known story in American urban history and beyond. Overall, these dwelling cards are a fascinating source, giving us insights into processes of inclusion and exclusion, as well as into the daily lives of people. How can we put these findings into the broader picture? First, the dwelling cards reflect the evolution of American consumer society at the time. So think of the state of household electrification and the availability of plumbing. Second, they reflect the history of inequality in US society, which could take a variety of forms and can be seen here in access to infrastructures. Third, from the perspective of the history of science, they reflect statistical attempts to make people's lives legible, that is, to gather information to better control and regulate populations. Fourth, they also reflect a still underexplored connection between the history of infrastructure and the making, remaking, and unmaking of social orders. And that is what the book I'm currently writing is about. I'm interested in how people consumed infrastructure in their daily lives and what kind of normative settings they created with their practices around infrastructures. I'm particularly interested in sociologist Max Weber's famous question, how is society possible? And I argue that when urban dwellers interacted with infrastructure, they were also negotiating how their society should look like. In doing so, I stand on the shoulders of scholars like Frank Trentmann, Matthew Gandy, and Nikhil Anand, who study the role of infrastructure in the formation of different societies. All three are concerned with specific urban spaces, and that is also what I'm doing in my research. When I talk about Los Angeles and Berlin today, I have to say that the book I'm working on is not a comparison between Berlin and Los Angeles. It is exclusively about Los Angeles. However, since I'm in the process of writing a journal article that addresses the very same questions for Berlin, I wanted to give a talk comparing the two cities. So I'm fascinated by Los Angeles because it is so different from the urban experience in Europe. People here carved out a life in a life-hostile environment. They created a space where the boundary between civilization and nature, the so-called wilderness, has always been blurred. Berlin, on the other hand, the city where I have lived for 20 years, is unique because it has experienced so many different political regimes, from the Kaiserreich to the World War I, to the Weimar Republic, from the so-called Third Reich to World War II, to the divided city. Berlin's volatile history across the 20th century, marked by really dramatic regime shifts, had a profound impact on everyday experience of urban infrastructure. And to give you some background, LA's rise to become a global city was closely linked to reckless real estate speculation, and imperialistic water politics. Since the Spanish period of what is Southern California today, people obtained their water from open ditches, the Sanyas. A privately organized utility, the Los Angeles City Water Company, began building a drinking water network in 1868. By the end of the 19th century, as more and more migrants settled in the LA basin, it became clear that local water sources would no longer be sufficient to provide water for the growing city. In 1902, the LA City Water Company was municipalized and the Department of Water and Power was formed. To meet the projected water demands of the future, the DWP, under the direction of Chief Engineer Mulholland, built a massive aqueduct which carried water from the Ovens River to Los Angeles. And this is probably a very well-known story here. Berlin, as we know it today, did not come into being until the creation of Greater Berlin in 1920. Before 1920, the old city of Berlin was a tiny municipality covering only 27 square miles. The new urban area, created in 1920, included no fewer than 7 other cities and 59 smaller communities. Overnight, Greater Berlin became the second largest city in the world, after Los Angeles. With almost 4 million residents, twice as many as the old city, it ranked 3rd after New York and London. Many of the former municipalities that were incorporated into Greater Berlin in 1920 had their own water and electricity utilities, which now had to be integrated into unified utilities owned and operated by the city. And this proved to be one of the greatest challenges of municipal politics in the 1920s. In both Berlin and Los Angeles, the first electric streetlights were installed in the 1880s. And public transport began using electricity in the 1890s. But relatively few households had electricity until the 20th century. This changed dramatically in the 1920s and 1930s, when the utilities in both cities received many applications a day for connections to the grid. Electricity in homes was not just used for lighting, as in the early days of electrification, but increasingly for powering a whole generation of household appliances. These devices to wash and iron clothes, heat water and rooms, or process food were marketed as time-saving devices and symbols of consumerist modernity, targeted primarily at the middle class housewife. In both Berlin and Los Angeles, electricity utilities cooperated with housing reformers, public health activists, and advocates of women's emancipation to spread the electric gospel. Just as electric appliances were revolutionizing the kitchen, so hot water appliances, showers, and flushing toilets were turning bathrooms into places of enjoyable hygiene. In the 1920s, bathrooms became really a standard feature of new homes. In Berlin, many of the dwellings in the 1920s were built as social housing, designed to be affordable for those with relatively low incomes. In a working class neighborhood like Wedding, the 40% of homes with electricity in 1928 may have represented a rapid increase from the mere 11% only 3 years previously, but it paled in comparison with wealthier neighborhoods like Charlottenburg, where the connection rate was 71%. In the 1930s, Berlin was considered the network city in Europe. Due to its large electrical industry, Berlin became known as the Electropolis, representing a model of urban modernity. Nevertheless, the dissemination of electric appliances in Berlin was relatively low compared to the United States in general and Los Angeles in particular. In Los Angeles, the number of connections increased by 47% between 1916 and 1921 alone. Utilities in Los Angeles offered particularly low rates for electric power, 22% lower than rates charged by San Francisco's utility. Not only did Los Angeles have the world's largest system of electric street lighting in the 1920s and the famous electric streetcars connecting the region, it can also be viewed as a pioneer in household electrification. While the breakthrough for household electrification in the US only came with federal programs introduced under the New Deal in the 1930s and early 1940s, The number of households connected varied hugely between the city's wealthier and poorer / non-white neighborhoods. So unequal access to urban infrastructure was particularly stark or pronounced in Los Angeles. Turning now more closely to everyday life with water and electricity, it is striking how unpredictable, dysfunctional, contingent, and transforming residents' daily interaction with infrastructure was. I think we tend to underestimate how often urban infrastructure did not work and residents were forced to improvise. And that is true for both Los Angeles and Berlin. In the following, I want to talk more about the year 1904 in Los Angeles and take this year as a kind of lens to discuss how we can tell the everyday history of infrastructure and how infrastructure was productive of social and political difference. Over the past few months, I have been researching the Los Angeles City archives and reading city council minutes. And I was really surprised by a recurring theme in these minutes, namely poor infrastructure. I was amazed at how often city officials reported leaking or broken pipes or sewers draining onto the streets. Reading these minutes, I quickly realized that dysfunctional infrastructures were something very commonplace in Los Angeles. So my question is, what did that mean then for urban society that took shape in Los Angeles? And just one example. On September the 20th, 1904, according to the minutes, the health officer said, and I quote, "I desire to call your attention to an old blind sewer running obliquely across Main Street and into the basement of building number 414 Main Street. The condition of this sewer is very unsanitary and a menace to the health and property interests in this neighborhood," unquote. It is instructive to see why this blind sewer was perceived as problematic. It posed a threat to health, pointing to the importance of personal hygiene and the idea of the sanitary city, and jeopardized economic interests, pointing to the importance of land ownership in Los Angeles and economic interests. Municipal government and residents of Los Angeles were regularly confronted with dysfunctional infrastructures. Experiencing interruptions in the network city had a profound impact on the making of the social fabric of the city, because social identities and relations remained fragile and continuously had to be reasserted. And my research shows that dysfunctional infrastructure was closely linked to the making of urban citizenship in Los Angeles. And this was not unique in Los Angeles. There's a rich literature on cities in the global south revealing how unstable and prone to failure urban infrastructure was. For example, I have learned a lot from Nikhil Anand's book on water infrastructure in Mumbai, where residents continuously experience leaking or breaking infrastructure or intermittent supply. And there's a tendency in the literature to associate failing infrastructure with cities in the global south. And my research shows that cities in the global north, Los Angeles and Berlin, were also regularly governed by infrastructure breakdown and uncertainty. Breaking pipes and power outages were as much a part of everyday life in Berlin as they were in Los Angeles. Greater Berlin grew so rapidly at the beginning of the 20th century that the water and power utilities could not keep up with laying sewers and power lines. Due to poorly executed work, inferior materials, or environmental conditions such as heavy rain, the non-functioning of infrastructure and the disruption of social orders was a constant companion in everyday urban life. This photo shows how sewers overflowed on York Street in the western part of the city after a summer cloudburst in 1902. It should be added, however, that floods did not have consequences as dramatic as floods of the Los Angeles River before it was turned into a storm drain in the 1930s. Nevertheless, floods in Berlin also challenged the city's self-confidence as a modern city with functioning infrastructure. Importantly, it was not only city officials who addressed the deficient infrastructure, but residents themselves wrote letters to the council, alerting them to the need of repairs. On August the 15th, 1904, a resident named A.N. McBurney wrote a letter to the Los Angeles City Council, noting that the electric light at the intersection of Grand Avenue and 3rd Street was burning on average only 2 nights a week. He asked that this to be fixed. And there are numerous other letters complaining about dysfunctional infrastructure. We have little information about who these citizens were who wrote to the council. We do know that they were almost exclusively men, that they had Euro-American names, so no Mexicans, no Chinese, and that they often lived in affluent neighborhoods. As a result, the story I'm going to tell today is very much a story about the male white middle classes. However, the fact that women and non-white people were rather unlikely to send letters to the city council does not mean that they did not have agency in the growing city. The extent to which women, for example, were able to reject household appliances is noteworthy and the subject of an extensive literature. Non-white and poor residents also found numerous ways to compensate for their exclusion from the network and make their voices heard. The white and male residents who wrote protest letters to the city council demanded better infrastructure, specifically pointing to the taxes they paid. Taxpayer protest was directed at both the urban built environment and the domestic sphere. My archival research suggests that beginning in the late 19th century in Berlin and Los Angeles, a historically novel sense of entitlement emerged that demanded a well-functioning urban space and a certain level of domestic comfort through a continuous water supply or a functioning sewage system. This development fits well with other research on the emergence of a middle class with changing expectations of domestic comfort. And this is also where gender roles were reinforced or changed. In Los Angeles, consumers of water and electricity played an active role, and the political functioned very much bottom-up. Providing impetus for the development of the city, consumers had a startling agency to shape the city. It was not municipal government that installed streetlights to better monitor public space and to make the city a safer place. This is the common argument in the literature. It was really the inhabitants themselves who urged the city council to install these lights because they had developed a different expectation of the permanence and stability of streetlights. And although this sense of entitlement existed in both cities, and everyday residents, so from the white male middle classes, helped shape urban infrastructure to an extent that has not been adequately acknowledged in the literature so far, I note a slight difference between Los Angeles and Berlin in my archival research, and I'm very careful not to fall into stereotypes. Berlin's urban infrastructure depended much more on government initiative than in Los Angeles. In sheer numbers alone, there were fewer letters to the city council about water and electricity supply in Berlin than in Los Angeles. Non-functioning infrastructures, to be sure, were commonplace in Berlin as well. The fact that Berliners were less likely to petition the city government themselves may be connected to a certain trust that Germans traditionally place in their authorities, but I'm not sure if that's really connected to that. It could also be related to the fact that the political structures of urban government were much more established in Berlin, with its long history of municipal rule, than in the far American West. In Berlin, at the beginning of World War II, a most peculiar letter of complaint came from the very top. This letter shows an intervention by Adolf Hitler himself in the Berlin water supply. It seems to have been the only time the dictator took a personal interest in Berlin's utility services. On September the 30th, 1940, Albert Speer, at the time the general building inspector for the capital, wrote a letter to the mayor of Berlin, informing him that Hitler was dissatisfied with the quality of Berlin's drinking water and called for a restructuring along the model of Vienna, Rome, and Athens. And I have found this letter in Timothy Moss' book, Remaking Berlin, which is really a great book on the history of urban infrastructure in Berlin. What Hitler meant by this was supplying water from mountain springs. This was a completely foolish intervention because the nearest mountains were 500 miles away, and Berlin had some of the cleanest drinking water in Europe. And it was to take 15 months and 4 extensive reports by different government agencies before Hitler was convinced that his idea was no good. Apart from such intervention by state leaders or dictators, the letters from everyday citizens offer a glimpse into the workings of various societies in Berlin and Los Angeles. They offer a view of everyday urban life through which we can examine how people constructed the urban, both in terms of the built environment and the social fabric. Everyday citizens not only addressed dysfunctional infrastructure, but they frequently made repairs themselves. In Los Angeles, they frequently did not want to wait for the repairman to visit their property. The council minutes show that it was often landowners themselves who carried out the repairs and informed the council afterwards of the repairs they made and asked for financial compensation, which they were usually granted. Practices of maintenance and repair were really ubiquitous in Los Angeles. My research shows that electricity utilities in Los Angeles encourage customers to repair and maintain equipment themselves. This consumer information published by the DWP in the 1920s explained to water users how to find a leak in their plumbing and fix it themselves. Another handout explained in detail how to read the electric meter. Both instructions were motivated by the financial argument that this would save the consumer money. However, this was only half the truth because the utility saved on repair and costs for sending out a meterman itself. My research suggests that there was a strong do-it-yourself call in Los Angeles in particular. The utilities transferred maintenance tasks to their customers, which certainly went well with normative settings such as the emphasis on self-help and autonomy in US society. The question of whether property owners should repair defective equipment themselves or whether meterman could enter a property, which was also highly controversial at the time, touched on issues of public and private control and autonomy. In 1902, Charles Holland, a prominent Los Angeles citizen, sued the local water board because a water meter had been installed on his property. He said that he could not bear to have representatives of the utility enter his property, which he felt constituted an unlawful trespass. Certainly, his opposition to the water meter had to do with money. The Los Angeles Times reported that his bill had been raised from a flat $2 to a meter rate of $8. In some ways, Holland's case nevertheless can be seen as an indicator that from the perspective of some urban dwellers in the far American West, the establishment of the network city clashed with their own emphasis on individual rights and private property. There was no comparable call for self-repair in Berlin. In contrast, Berlin utilities became increasingly interested in understanding who their consumers were and how they were using their services. No longer seeing consumers as passive, but as significant market players with diverse and often unpredictable desires, utilities in Berlin started to influence consumer behavior. The electricity utility BEWAG introduced a hire purchase scheme for household appliances in 1926 called Electrissima, which proved to be very successful and proved to be a major driving force in the dissemination of electricity in Berlin. BWAC also attempted to manage off-peak electricity consumption to relieve pressure on its limited generation capacity by introducing a lower nighttime rate of 8 pfennigs per kilowatt hour instead of 16 pfennigs. And this recognized the power of consumers to influence utility demand and the design of infrastructure. While electricity utilities tried to nudge consumers to use more electricity in both Berlin and Los Angeles, saving water emerged as a political priority only in Los Angeles. In Berlin, saving water was understood in terms of capture, that is, retaining river water for urban use to prevent it being lost downstream. There was no consideration at all that reducing water demand might be part of this solution. The first outright water saving campaign I have found in Los Angeles dates back to 1917, when DWP urged consumers to please do not waste water. In 1917 was a particularly dry year, and although the Los Angeles aqueduct was opened only 4 years ago, the utility feared that residents consumed too much water. These attempts to change the behavior of everyday residents were accompanied by debates about what normal consumption meant, how much water residents were entitled to use and for what. So what were legitimate everyday activities that required the use of water? Personal hygiene was hardly an issue, but what about washing of driveways? How often did the lawn need to be watered? Could non-white residents be expected to reduce water consumption more than middle-class households? Such questions reverberated when council members or utilities discussed concepts of normal consumption. In these efforts to save water, questions about what Los Angeles should look like, who was included and who remained excluded, kept emerging. And they are the focus of my ongoing research. If it is possible at all to compare Los Angeles and Berlin, I hope it has become clear that these two different cities have one thing in common. They each stood for a specific idea of urban modernity. Los Angeles strived to be a garden city. Berlin staged itself as an electropolis. Besides public transport, the availability of water and even more so of electricity characterized the essence of the modern metropolis in both cities. The notion of modernity was also linked to the exclusion of certain populations from these infrastructures. Overall, the everyday history of infrastructure offers a lens on the formation of the modern individual. Sociologist Georg Simmel, in his widely read book, The Metropolis and Mental Life, suggests that the urban dweller's attitude and psychology is fundamentally different to an individual that inhabits rural life. While it goes beyond the scope of my paper to discuss these adaptations and adjustments, which ultimately reflect the structures of the metropolis, there's a good deal of evidence that rapid changes in the built environment, notably in urban infrastructure, contributed to the emergence of what people at the time understood as the modern individual. And this notion, of course, was a normative one, and therefore it was highly contested. So my argument is that as people adapted to having water and electricity in their daily lives, they essentially searched for social order. They negotiated what services they expected their municipality to provide, to what extent they wanted to allow state authorities onto their properties, what their expectations were for the functioning of infrastructure, what domestic comfort should mean for them, and what gender roles should look like. And they also negotiated who should remain excluded from the network and thus from urban society. Exploring the everyday history of infrastructure means talking about the very fabric of society, the physical bones of the city and the meaning urban dwellers attach to them. For me, researching everyday infrastructure is about different notions of the public and the private, and about processes of inclusion and exclusion. Race and class inequalities became firmly embedded in the urban infrastructure. They shaped social relations in the city for a long time to come, because infrastructures from a material history point of view are durable and to some extent resist some change. They preserve these hierarchies over time. And I want to conclude my talk by emphasizing that race, class, and public-private tensions were something very tangible, that they were formed and negotiated in local contexts, such as homes and neighborhoods, as well as through these interactions with quotidian infrastructures, such as water taps or electric appliances. And if this is true, we should focus our attention more than we have done so, than we have done so far on the local and on microspaces such as living rooms, kitchens, and bathrooms. As Carlos Williams once said, the local is the only thing that is universal. Thank you so much.
Okay, let me just. I want to thank you, Jan. That was really something. I think very elegantly crafted, because you're operating on so many different levels: environmental, technological, consumer, and the list could go on. So I think, not that you have tied your path conclusions, but still that you're able to create a kind of model that accommodates these two places, which are so different, yet there are some really important similarities, I think is really impressive. If it's okay, I'll just ask one question quickly, and then we'll see if people have come in to the chat or here in person want to ask questions. I guess I want to just ask you if you can push things a bit further, because you are kind of speculating about the modern individual, and I definitely see how a certain kind of consumer is born, and someone who articulates their rights as a consumer, and how that then creates kind of different fault lines around gender and class and race. But I'm interested if you could expand on this concept of the modern individual kind of more fully and explain what you mean by it and kind of what some of its other implications are. So then I think maybe I'll sit down and Elizabeth can handle the chat, and you can call on people in the room.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. That's a great and an important question. Well, I would say the modern individual really, first of all, is a contemporary notion. So really something that the people at the time had in their mind, and that was important for their self-conception and the way they made kind of sense of the world. And for them, being modern really meant having access to water infrastructure and having electric appliances in their homes, and really kind of having a right to these urban amenities, so to speak. And of course, there was no such thing as the modern individuals. There were many different modern individuals. So this was a very contested and a very complex concept at the time. As far as I can see in my research, really this entitlement thinking, this idea that people have a right to water and power and to continuous water supplies and not intermittent water supplies, and to clean drinking water, and to a stable supply with electricity. That was really at the core of this concept of the modern individual that emerged in white middle-class households in both cities, and certainly also in many other cities at the time in Europe and in North America. But of course, there were also many other levels where people negotiated this concept. So public transport certainly was an important subject that constituted this kind of modernity, especially in Berlin, where the subway was built during that time, and also in Los Angeles, where these streetcars, red streetcars, electric streetcars, connected the region. Yeah, you will probably also find this kind of modernity in cities like New York. So there's a great book by Stefan Höhne, Inventing the Modern Passenger, I think it is called, something like that. And Stefan Höhne shows how important this kind of the subway system was for the idea of the network city that in the end contributed to this idea of urban modernity. But for the kind of modernity that I'm interested in, so really ideas of domestic comfort, water and electricity are central. Does this answer your question?
Absolutely, thank you.
We have a question from Volker Johnson, who's tuned in virtually. He's curious, would you say that infrastructure inequalities made inequality more readable in the urban landscape? Basically, after all, infrastructure privileges could no longer then be ascribed on individuals, but were characteristics of neighborhoods. Does this show up in the public debate that you have looked at?
Hi, Volker. Thank you very much for this question. Also a great question. Yes, I think this is really a great perspective on what I presented. Uneven access to infrastructure is really something where you can kind of see inequalities in the city, in the urban landscape. So, for example, in Los Angeles, Chinese people living in Chinatown were excluded from supplied water, from networks of supplied water until the 1920s. And also in Sonora Town, so the Mexican neighborhood of Los Angeles, there were no sewers until the end of the 19th century. At the same time, neighborhoods inhabited by white middle-class people enjoyed sewers and tap water from the 1870s and 1880s onward. So I think you can really see these differences, these social differences, and these social inequalities with regard to uneven access to infrastructure and in the kind of outer appearance of the city. So how neighborhoods looked like, and so I would totally agree. These uneven access to infrastructure are very readable and make these inequalities kind of readable, and you can see them.
Peter, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, so this is, I really like this. This is great to connect, because so much of the literature on these infrastructures is kind of mega level, looking at hydropower dams or big aqueducts, and connecting it to actually what's going on in households is fantastic. I also like the inclusion of the maintenance of these things, because again, a lot of history of technology looks at innovation and building the things, and then the maintainers group is now kind of trying to bring maintenance to the fore in history of technology. So my question is to kind of pursue a little bit more of this idea of so what is, I'm particularly interested in LA, and kind of what is exceptional about LA in its infrastructure or in its approach to infrastructure, and how is LA exceptional? How is it typical? It seems like, my impression is that LA is kind of seen compared to Berlin, it has a self-image that's maybe seen from outside as kind of provincial. When it comes to science, technology, and possibly infrastructure, compared to a place like Berlin, which has, it's got Siemens, it's got high-tech industry, it's got these modern, world-leading research universities in science and engineering, compared to LA, which is, 1900 is kind of this, provincial bird. You mentioned one thing about LA is it kind of maybe greater role of private interests. But I think it maybe expand a little bit on what was possibly exceptional about LA's infrastructure. approach to infrastructure.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for this question. What is exceptional in LA? Well, I would say it's rapid urbanization. It happened, everything happened so quickly, so fast. And LA really was a latecomer compared to Berlin and to other cities on the East Coast. And also, yeah, really these drastic inequalities in the city that are mirrored in urban infrastructure and in uneven access to infrastructure. I mean, we also have this in other American cities, but I think what we can see here in LA is really extreme. And also this this blurring of the boundary between the urban and the rural. This blurring of the boundary between civilization, nature, which created a lot of challenges for the urban development of Los Angeles, because I mean, the city is so hilly, it has so many mountains, and it was so hard for engineers to bring water to houses on the top of these hills, of these mountains. So water pressure really was a problem. And I think it is really necessary, as you said, to zoom into households and to really, do this kind of micro-history of water infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, to explore these things that make LA exceptional. At the same time, I think we should not exceptionalize LA, but it's really an example of processes that took place basically everywhere, in Berlin, in San Francisco, in Chicago, in New York. It's just maybe more visible here.
Let me combine a couple of questions. One comes from Simon Judkins. So this is an era, or portions of it, that we associate, at least with Los Angeles, with kind of a progressive era, right? And discourses around health and quote unquote Americanization, and connecting those sometimes to infrastructure. So do you see either in LA or Berlin discourses specifically connecting health, purity, and modernity to municipal drinking water? How is that coming through in either these individuals' family stories on the cards, or in the kind of public discourse that you're seeing at the city council meetings?
Okay, great. Thank you for this question. Yeah, this is really something I haven't really touched about in my presentation, because there's so much literature on the connection between health reform, the sanitary idea, the sanitary movement, and the attempt to solve social problems. There really was a problem, or the sanitary movement, which originated in England and then spread to continental Europe and to the United States, promised to also solve social problems. That was really important, and that was also very present, very tangible here in Los Angeles. Supplying clean drinking water was first and foremost meant to improve the health of the white middle classes, and to really help people, and especially women and mothers, living more healthy, so to speak. It was only expanded to non-white and to non-white people, and was only meant to help really improve their living conditions at the end of the 19th century. So there were really these anti-Chinese attitudes, sentiments, and anti-Mexican immigrant attitudes. They were really strong in Los Angeles, and they kind of prevented social reformers to also pay for house connections for these people, so that they could also benefit from supplied water. So that was really a problem, but there was a very close connection between health So the sanitary idea, the sanitary movement, and the promise to solve the social question.
We have a question that spans quite a lot of time. So I'll read it as it's written. How has Berlin's solid waste and sewage water quality management changed after the 1989 reunification? Was pre-World War II infrastructure, so the subject of our talk in part, able to be reused to current population conditions?
So this question is about the 1990s, right?
I think it's about the connection between pre-World War II infrastructure and then post-1989.
Okay. This is really something I do not know much about, I have to confess. The division of the city really posed serious problems for urban infrastructure because the unitary utility services had to be divided into east and west, which only occurred in the 1960s when the Berlin Wall was built. So really late into the Cold War. And it also took really some time in the 1990s to unify the divided utility services. And what the impact on solid waste infrastructure really was, I can only speculate, but I would recommend to take a look into Timothy Moss's book, Remaking Infrastructure, because he covers a really long period of investigation from the late 19th century or the 1920s to the 2000s, early 2000s. So yeah, this goes way beyond my paper today. I'm sorry.
We have time for one more. Right. A question from Molly. Could you speak more to the comparative differences in terms of the environmental limitations placed on the provision of utilities? For example, the different levels of precipitation, depth of the water table, or even geographic size of each city. To what extent, if at all, can we think of these as quote unquote objective factors that structure development?
Okay, great question. Thank you for that. Well, obviously, there are huge differences between Southern California, where rainfall is scarce, and Berlin, where there's enough rainfall, but still a very thirsty city. And of course, the soil conditions, I do not know much about soil conditions in LA and in Berlin, but they differ as well. So, and I'm not sure. I mean, there's an ongoing debate in the literature whether these are objective conditions or not. Obviously, there's something which people can hardly really change, but our categories with which we understand these differences, with which we measure rainfall, or with which we determine soil conditions, they're human-made. So there's certainly something in this picture which is not merely objective, and which has to do with how we classify things and how we, with our knowledge systems and with our bodies of knowledge that we have developed. But of course, there are very obvious differences between the two cities, which, yeah, maybe makes it hard to compare these two cities. So this is really why I decided to only write a book about LA, do a comparison.
Okay, I guess I'll bring proceedings to a close. I was just thinking, really throughout the talk of the, I think really interesting whether you're using the source material, Jan, and that if there are any graduate students listening, for example, this is, I think, an object lesson in kind of how to make, I mean, first of all, the diligence of archival research, but making sources like these census cards or the complaints to about utilities, which reminded me of some work I'd read about East German consumers complaining about things and how that opens up space in what was often thought of as a dictatorship where people have no agency, but you can see actually people, right, they can demand things and sometimes those demands are actually satisfied or taken very seriously anyway. But just, I think, a really masterful demonstration of how to use sources and kind of get at questions that are often quite elusive to historians. So I really want to thank you again for just such a rich and thoughtful presentation. And it's just a great moment to kind of stop and for a lot of us to hear what you've been working on while you're here. So thank you so much. And thank you to everybody, those of you who are here in person and to people who are watching online. And I think we will be able to make a recording available for those who weren't able to be here with us today one way or another. So